Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. If you're familiar with this channel at all, you'll know that Tomorrow Never Dies is one of my very favourite Bond films. It is a non-stop, adrenalizing experience, probably the most action-heavy Bond film of them all, and I think it's fairly well known now how troubled that production was, with the film receiving almost daily on-set rewrites, and by the admission of all involved, it didn't even have a completed script until filming had ended. So, Raymond Benson, your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to write a novelization of a film script that doesn't exist in a completed form, and you have 2 months to do it in. Piece of cake, right? Just even thinking about the pressure of that assignment gives me heart palpitations, God. So when it comes to Bond novelizations, this is the 5th that I have read so far, and at this point I feel like my criteria for what I'm looking for in these is quite clear. First, can they enrich my understanding and appreciation of the film on which they are based, and then can they also just be enjoyed on their own merits without making you wish you were just watching the film instead. I probably plug this book to the point of annoyance at this stage, but the Christopher Wood Spy Who Loved Me novelization is still a high bar for me when it comes to Bond novelizations. And look, I know that by their very nature, novelizations are marketing tie-ins, right? But if they can add some interesting additional context to the film's story and characters, if they can retell sequences on the page in fun and interesting ways, then I consider myself to be a happy Bond fan, which is exactly what I was when I was reading Raymond Benson's Tomorrow Never Dies. The novelization follows the broad strokes of the plot of the film, as you would expect. Bond is tasked with investigating media baron Elliot Carver, who it turns out is trying to manufacture a war between Britain and China, largely so that he can take his media empire to dizzying heights of reach. Bond teams up with a fellow agent in Wei Lin, who is investigating Mr. Carver as well. MQ, Moneypenny, Paris Carver, Henry Gupta, Dr. Kaufman, Mr. Stamper, Admiral Roebuck, General Chang are all here. The story goes from the terrorist bazaar to London to Hamburg to Saigon to Carver's stealth boat, just like you see in the film. Now, as I say, I love the film of Tomorrow Never Dies. It's one of my go-to Bonds, and you know, it is one of the most action-packed from pretty much the halfway point. The film is non-stop action, and so I do think that it's a bit of an ask to ask any author to okay, make this work on the page, because if it is just gonna be a transcription of what you see on screen, it'd be like a text version of the film's audio description track. So to counter that, Benson adds in a good few extra scenes, details, character backgrounds, which is all really cool. Chiefly, I felt of particular interest were some of the additional scenes focusing on Wei Lin. In the film, we as an audience are introduced to Wei Lin at the same time as Bond at Elliot Carver's launch party, but in the book, we have a whole chapter taking place prior to that entirely follows Wei Lin investigating General Chang, Carver's co-conspirator, only seen very briefly in the film. I did talk a little bit about General Chang in my big in-depth video review of the film, particularly on the subject of him, for a character that has no lines in the film, that only appears very briefly. His sort of objective out of this whole villainous scheme is arguably grander and a bit more worthy of Bond and Wei Lin's time than Elliot Carver. And while the novelization doesn't add to Chang to the extent that I ever feel like he's on a level pegging with Elliot Carver, like Carver is still very much the main villain of this story, the novelization does add just enough to General Chang to justify his presence in the story more than the film does, I think. We even get some closure to him in this version of the story. We never find out what happens to him in the film. In the book we do, and it's very funny. I did quite enjoy reading what happens to General Chang. But yes, as I say, Wei Lin's role feels much more expanded. It will in the novelization in general, to be honest. Even in bits like the whole Hamburg, Carver's launch party stuff, it plays out a little bit differently to what you see in the film, and there's a bit more fun interplay between Bond and Wei Lin in the book. In the film, you kind of just have that one moment where they have a brief exchange.
Exactly what kind of banking do you specialize in, Mr. Bond?
Hostile takeovers. Shall we?
It's much more playful in the novelization, I think, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, they're chatting, and they both know that there's something going on with the other one, and they know that they're not the bankers that they say they are. They know that the other one is up to something, but I really liked that. It had me thinking back to Anya from The Spy Who Loved Me and Bond's interplay with her in that film, and yeah, so I really loved all of the added bits with Wei Lin in this. And on a similar note with Elliot Carver, too, a good chunk of a chapter in this is all about his backstory. It takes place in the narrative as the character has left Hamburg, he's heading to Saigon, and he's on his jet, and he's just kind of musing about his life, and then we get the whole story about how he came to be a media baron, how he was the bastard child of an aristocrat and a prostitute, how he did away with his dad, and it's really engrossing stuff. Again, just harkening back to That Spy Who Loved Me novelization, I loved in that book how we had passages dedicated to Stromberg's backstory. It really enriched the character that you see on the screen, and same here. I feel like I've come out of this with a kind of an enhanced appreciation of Elliot Carver. Now, I think it goes without saying that this is stuff that I'm not necessarily saying that, oh, I'm lamenting the fact that this information isn't in the film. I mean, some of this stuff, it might feel really overly expositional if it were in the film. It's just not necessary, perhaps, for the story that they're telling on the screen, but for a novelization, and for someone who really loves the characters in this film, I got such a kick out of digging deeper into them and enriching my understanding and appreciation of them through this book. In a similar vein, we get a lot more on Stamper too, and we learn more about his pleasure and pain receptors are flipped. This is something that I really wish that they'd used in the film, because it's one of those quirky henchman things that gives Stamper much more of a special skill. It kind of makes him stand out from being just another big blonde muscular type that we see quite frequently in Bond films. On that note, one of the things that really stuck out to me when reading the book, I'll remember this for a while, it's just so damn creepy. Stamper is kind of demonstrating to Bond how his whole pleasure pain thing works. So he stabs himself with a knife, and because he's feeling pleasure from it, he says to Carver, "Can I keep it in?" And that is just like, oh god, I was reading this on the tube and just, it had me shuddering. I thought it was just so brilliant and creepy. Similar, actually, for Stamper's demise in this version of the story. Things are slightly different from what we see in the film, but when Stamper is dying, he's letting out this, it's like he's having the greatest orgasm of his life, and it's just bonkers and brilliant. And indeed, the climax broadly played out quite differently to what we see in the film. There are some sequences in this that play out very much like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. The geography of the locations and whatever makes sense for how I'm used to those locations being in the film, for instance. We're on Carver's stealth boat at the end. The broad strokes, things play out in a very similar way, just slightly differently, but then Bond and Stamper are having a fist fight on the outside, on the top of the stealth ship, which is really cool, and the ship gets a hole blown in its hull, and a big part of the climax is Carver's men trying to cover that hole back up, because that is the specific thing that is exposing them to the radar of the British fleet. In general, I'm finding Benson's action sequences to be very adrenalizing and fun to experience too, even when they are, obviously based on the stuff that we see in the film. I find that there are just details and little bits of Bond's thought process in there, so when I'm reading the novelization, I'm not necessarily just imagining the scenes exactly as they do play out in the film. It is still that thing of picturing a kind of a different, an alternate dimension version of the film playing out in my head, which I really enjoyed. There's also a lot more on M in here too, specifically her sort of standing up to Admiral Roebuck and the Minister of Defense. The novelization really underlines the fact that she is actually putting her job on the line by saying, there's something up with this Carver guy and I'm sending Bond to investigate. I just felt that it added even more to the stakes of the situation, Bond is having to do this for, his boss's sake as well. I mean, I guess in the film, the threat of World War III is stakes enough, so maybe you don't need this detail in there. But I do feel like with it, Benson was really building on how he established M in 0-30. She's not just kind of functionally there as Bond's boss in this story. She very much has personal stakes in the story, which I thought was really cool. On the subject of continuity, actually, Benson is writing this in continuity with his previous book, so it continues on from there, reference made to Hong Kong, that whole adventure, and there are a few nods to the film series, again, which I really enjoyed. There's a bit where Benson actually covers the discrepancy between what Bond says to Moneypenny in You Only Live Twice.
Instant Japanese. You may need it.
You forget I took a first in Oriental Languages at Cambridge.
And then the fact that he's a bit stumped by Wayland's keyboard later in the film.
On second thoughts, You type.
So Benson actually has Bond musing about how he lied to Moneypenny when he said he had a first in Oriental languages, which I thought was pretty funny. Again, you just know that Benson is obviously a big Bond fan himself with a deep love of this series and the character, and it comes through in little, very unintrusive ways like that, which I find very reassuring. It's a bit of a contrast with John Gardner, and I didn't really realize that at the time, I don't think, but now being, you know, a couple of books into Benson's era, you could have told me, you know, that Gardner had never actually watched a Bond film in his life, and I'd probably have believed you, but there just wasn't the same level of joy for the series and character like there is in the Benson stories that I've experienced so far. Interestingly, Tanner is a character in the novelization, fulfilling the role from the film that Robinson occupies. Obviously, for the film version, they wanted to have Michael Kitchen back from GoldenEye as Tanner. Scheduling conflicts meant that they had to create a new character played by Colin Salmon as the MI6 Chief of Staff. I'll be curious when we get around to the World Is Not Enough novelization whether Robinson is introduced there or whether Benson will continue to use Tanner, because I must say, in the film, you just kind of roll with it. In the books, Tanner is so much more of a consistent presence that if he had just been conspicuously absent from this story and it was just Robinson in his place in the book, it would have felt a little odd. So yes, I thought this was a really successful novelization. If you are a fan of Tomorrow Never Dies, then I do think that this thing is a must-read. I think that it brilliantly enriches the lore of the film. The details it creates and expands upon are really interesting and give so much extra depth to characters in a way that feels completely natural and in keeping with how they are presented in the film. When I next watch Tomorrow Never Dies, I am going to be thinking about Carver's backstory and how it made him the man that he is in the film and all, and it's just so nicely judged. As well as that, though, it is also just a very fun book to read in its own right. I whizzed through it. I thought it was very exciting, a real good page-turner. Sadly, much like the Christopher Wood novelizations, I don't think that Tomorrow Never Dies has had that much in the way of reprints over the years, which is a shame. Again, just sadly, I think that these novelizations are kind of treated as promotional tie-ins more than anything else. But if you do come across a copy of it on eBay or in a secondhand bookshop, then I highly recommend picking it up, particularly if you are a big fan of the film. As always, please do let me know your own thoughts on the book in the comment section below. There are links below to my various social media pages and, of course, the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button. So do click those if you haven't done so already, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.